We titled this series that we're doing now, it's called It's Complicated. We weren't trying to be negative, but we're trying to be very realistic. A lot of times people say, well, you know, in my relationships, we wish it was A plus B equals C. It's not always that way. This is not a mathematical explanation. And so people look for fixes. We look for things to fix and to change. But instead of looking for fixes or for formulas, look for principles. And God, who created us, who made us, knows the principle and has principles that work. The challenge is God's principles are different. Sometimes they're counterintuitive. For example, if I said, hey, how could you improve your relationships? Immediately, often the thoughts go to, well, I need my spouse to do this. I need my kids to do this, my friends to do this. And we often think of need. And yet when God thinks about improving relationships, he thinks of seed. What seeds can I plant? What seeds can I sow? We're going to talk about that this morning as we talk about doing good, planting good seeds. But first we have to understand that the way God works and the way the world works is different. When I say the world, I'm talking about those situations and those philosophies and those thoughts that they don't have God in them. For example, basic motivators in the world would be fear, pride, and selfishness. Fear, I'm not going to have enough. Pride, it's that arrogance. I'm better than you. I'm not better than you, but I'm better than you. We're always looking for someone we can be better than. There was a college professor, a very arrogant college professor. He was on a plane sitting next to an older gentleman. Guy didn't look like he's kind of an older, kind of average guy. And this professor, very arrogant. He gets bored during the flight. He says to the older gentleman, he said, you want to play a game? The older man looks at him and says, what kind of game? He said, well, here's the deal. So you can ask me a question. If I can't answer it, I give you $1. Then I'll ask you a question. If you can't answer it, you give me $1. And old man said, no thanks. The college professor was irritated that this guy told him no. He said, I'll tell you what, he said, if you ask me a question and I can't answer it, I'll give you $10. And if you can't answer my question, 1. That's all you get, 10 to 1 odds. Guy said, no thanks. Professor now is frustrated. He bumped it to 50 to 1. Old man said, no, I really don't. Finally, he said, because he just wanted to prove he was superior, he said, I'll give you 100 to 1. If I can't answer your question, I'll give you $100. And if you can't answer mine, all you have to do is give me 1. And finally, the old guy said, all right, all right. He said, I get to go first. Professor said, shoot. Old man looked at him and said, what has 5 heads, 40 feet, and lives inside a bucket? College professor begins to think, man, he's racking his brain. He is thinking, he's going through all kinds of things. Finally, after about 30 minutes of hard work, he looks at that old guy and says, okay. He said, I have no idea. I have no idea. And he pulls $100 out of his billfold and hands it to the old man. The old man takes it, puts it in his pocket. And then the college professor said, okay, what has 5 heads, 40 feet, and lives inside a bucket? Old man looked at him and said, I have absolutely no idea. Here's your $1 right here. My mother used to tell me pride goes before a fall, goes before losing $100 too. So it's fear, it's pride, it's selfishness. I saw a TV commercial just yesterday where the guy's selling vehicles, and he looked in that camera and he said, the luxury you deserve. I'm like, that's right. I deserve that love. It's all about us. Actually, the world operates in what Stephen Covey called a scarcity mentality. Scarcity mentality said there's only one pie and there's really not enough pie. And if someone gets a bigger piece of pie than you, then there's not going to be enough for you. And so we're always battling for resources and battling for everything because there's just not enough pie. But you know, God's ways are different. He doesn't work on fear and pride and selfishness. God works on faith and humility and love. He works on faith. We believe before we see it. Humility says we acknowledge God. We're not saying we're little, we're just saying he's big. And then in love, we're saying we're not looking for what people can do for us, we're looking for what we can do for them. So it's a different thought. So one of the kingdom principles in God's ways, it's very different from our ways, is the phrase sowing and reaping. Now, depending on your background and upbringing, when you hear sowing and reaping, I know sometimes people can think, sowing and reaping. My mother used to tell me, often it was in the context of a prayer over the food. My mom used the blessing to deliver mini sermons. I mean, we're all waiting to eat the food, and she's like, Lord, takes that deep breath. You're like, oh, here we go. We're going to be here a little bit. Lord, you know that when we're not doing good, when we're sowing the wrong seeds, we're going to reap a bad harvest. I'm like, what has that got to do with eating this food? It has nothing. But the idea, it's negative. You sow bad seeds, you're going to reap a bad harvest. So it has a negative connotation. Or when people think of sowing seeds, some people think only of finances. I can sow a financial seed. Is that accurate? Yes, it is. But it's not the entire scope. Actually, sowing and reaping has a lot to do with our relationships. I want to show you a passage from Galatians. It's Galatians chapter 6. Paul is writing, he said, do not be deceived. God is not mocked. For whatever a man sows, that he will also reap. He who sows to his flesh will of the flesh reap corruption. He who sows to the Spirit will of the Spirit reap everlasting life. And let us not grow weary while doing good. For in due season we shall reap if we don't lose heart. Therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all, especially to those who are of the household of faith. Now, this is all about relationships here. Not just about finances, but when there's that phrase there, sowing to the flesh and sowing to the Spirit. Sometimes that's a little blind, but you have to understand chapter 5 comes before chapter 6. And in chapter 5, Paul begins to lay out what we call the works of the flesh and the fruit of the Spirit. And in the works of the flesh, people, when we say works of the flesh, immediately people's minds go to sexual sins. He lists adultery, he lists fornication. Is that it? Yeah, that's part of it, but it's only a small part of the whole spectrum. Because when he lists works of the flesh, he also lists works like hatred, contentions, which is arguing, outburst of wrath, blowing up, losing your temper. He's calling these works of the flesh jealousy, envy, selfish ambitions. He even lists murder in there, because we certainly, you get too mad, it can go to that. And so he's listing these, and he's saying if you sow these in your relationship, it's not going to be good. He said, but if you sow to the Spirit, people say, what does that mean, sowing to the Spirit? Well, he lists the fruit of the Spirit. And some of the fruit of the Spirit has to do with our relationships. Love, that has to do with relationships. Long-suffering means the ability to put up with people for a long time. Just look straight ahead. Just smile and look this way. Then there's kindness, there's goodness. All of these are relational. So when Paul's writing, he's saying, listen, he's saying, don't kid yourself. How many of you know you sow mean seeds, you're not going to reap a good harvest? You sow those unkind things. But yet if you sow the good things, he said, there's good things coming. He said, don't get weary in doing good. So he calls sowing some of these seeds doing good. So listen, here's one of the things that we learn in life. I've been married for 37 years. I've got 3 kids. I've got grandkids now. So I can honestly speak to this. You cannot control people. You cannot make people do what you want. You say, well, I put a gun to their head. Okay, you put a gun to their head. Their heart's not in it. They're only doing it out of fear. You can force someone, but you can't control people. You can't control people. You can control the seeds you sow. So you can choose to sow good seeds. And if you sow good seeds, there's a reward. It is a long-term strategy. It's not quick. And I know we're used to quick. We love quick. It's not quick. It's the long game. We're going to play for the long game, but it has huge results. And even science is starting to figure this out. John Gottman is one of the most famous secular psychologists who deals particularly with marriage. He said in marriage, he looks for 2 things, contempt and kindness. He said when he sees contempt in the marriage, what do you mean contempt? Contempt is that eye roll, that criticism that only sees the negative in the other person, misses all the positive. It's treating people with the cold shoulder or a minimal response. And what he says is contempt, the way it makes people feel, is it makes them feel like they're invisible, like they're not cared for, like they have no value. Now, if I just described your relationship, the good news is you can change that. And you can sow seeds of kindness. And studies have shown that kindness is a glue that will often keep marriages together. Listen, if it works in marriages, it works in friendships. Kindness, he said, kindness makes people feel as if they have value, as if they're heard, they're understood, that they're not invisible. And they said, actually, when you begin to sow seeds of kindness, when people see kindness, it actually encourages them to be kind and sparks off not a death spiral, but a life spiral of love and generosity. You see, God who made us knows exactly how we tick, and he knows what works for us. And we can sow good seeds. I want to show you from the Bible just a story this morning of David who sowed some amazingly good seeds. I love the story of David. I think what appeals to me about David is sometimes people think that godly people and godly men, or especially men, we get this, that if you're a godly man, then you're kind of this weak little man that just kind of walks around slumped over going, praise the Lord. And no man wants to do that. The thing I like about David is he's not just a poet, he's a warrior, and he's a leader. But he has to have some godly characteristics. One of the stories I share a lot in this church is 1 Samuel 30 about David and Ziklag. David and his band of 600 men and their families are running from King Saul. They're living in a city called Ziklag, and when David and the fighting men leave, 600 leave, they come back 3 days later and find out that a group of people called the Amalekites, which are some bad hombres, have come into Ziklag and have burned it and then kidnapped all the women and children. Didn't kill anybody, but took all their stuff and their families. When David and his men saw that, the Bible said they cried until they couldn't cry anymore. But then the next phrase says, and in fact, the men were talking about killing David. But I love the next verse. It says, but David encouraged himself in the Lord his God. So David found strength in God. And David prayed and said, Lord, what do you want me to do with these people? And the Lord said, go after them, because you'll get them and you'll recover all. So David and his 600 men, man, they take off. They're going after. They're going to get their wives and kids. They're going to get their stuff back. And they're going to put a beat down on the Amalekites. So I added that. That's not necessarily in the scriptures, but here's what the scriptures say here. David and 600 men with him came to the Besor Valley where some stayed behind. 200 of them were too exhausted to cross the valley, but David and the other 400 continued the pursuit. Now, we'll just stop just for a minute. You got 600 men, you're already outnumbered, and you come to this valley. Some translations say it was a brook. And David and his 400 men, they cross over, and then David looks back, and there's 200 guys on the other side. And David asked one of his lieutenants, what's going on with those guys? And they're like, David, sir, they said they're too tired. What? You're too tired? You got a bunch of bad people who just kidnapped your wife and your little 4-year-old daughter and your son, little Sparky and Sparkette, they got them. And you're too tired? You're tired? How many of you, I don't know about you, I would have been semi-angry. In fact, probably more than semi-angry. There could have been a blow-up right there. He could have said, what is with you wimps? Would you get your rear ends across this valley and let's go? But they're too tired. And so, man, there could have been a fight in the valley. No peace in the valley. Could have been a fight in the valley. And David and his men just kept going. That's pretty amazing in itself. David had to forgive those guys and go on. Now, I need to read some text to you. It's a little bit long, but stay with me here. I found a guy who led David down to where the Amalekites were, and there they were, scattered over the countryside, eating and drinking and reveling because of the great amount of plunder they had taken from the land of the Philistines and from Judah. David fought them from dusk until the evening of the next day. It's about 24 hours. And none of them got away except 400 young men who rode off on camels and fled. David recovered everything the Amalekites had taken, including his 2 wives. Nothing was missing, young or old, boy or girl, plunder or anything else they had taken. David brought everything back. Then David said to the 200 men who had been too exhausted to follow him and who were left behind at the Besor Valley. They came out to meet David and the men with him. As David and his men approached, he asked them how they were. But all the evil men, troublemakers among David's followers said, because they didn't go out with us, we will not share with them the plunder we recovered. However, each man may take his wife and his children and go. And David replied, no, my brothers, you must not do that with what the Lord has given us. He has protected us and delivered into our hands the raiding party that came against us. Who will listen to what you say? The share of the men who stayed with the supplies is to be the same as that of him who went down to the battle. All will share alike. And David made this statute and ordinance for Israel from that day to this. And when David reached Ziklag, he sent some of the plunder to the elders of Judah who were his friends, saying, here's a gift from you, from the plunder of the Lord's enemies. This story amazes me. First, the fact that David's fighting force was reduced by 1/3, and he still kept going. They beat these Amalekites. They were operating on the word of the Lord. They beat these Amalekites, and then when they're coming back, so can you imagine they've been fighting for 24 hours, they're all sweaty and nasty and hot and bloody, and they got swords, and they got all these kids, goats, and there's a bunch of stuff. And they come back, and the 200 men who were too tired to go and fight come out and say, hey, man, don't you know that would have been a great time to give them the cold shoulder? Now, I need to just clarify something. Cold shoulder, if you're a boomer or above, cold shoulder, you know what the cold shoulder is. You just like, You give them the old silent treatment, like, If you're a Gen X, you just defriended them on Facebook. And if you're younger than that, a millennial or lower, you ghosted them. You said they're gone. See, different groups like, oh yeah, I got that. You ghost them, they're out, they're done. Man, you don't want to talk to these guys. You certainly don't want to go. But David walks up to them and goes, how are you guys doing? How are you doing? They've been sitting around while David's been fighting. And he asked them, how you're doing. Boy, was he kind to them. And then you had some guys, the Bible said they were evil men who said, look, give them their wives and kids and let them go. And he said, no. He said, we got all this plunder. And David was generous to people who didn't even deserve it. And then he gave gifts to people all over Israel. It's amazing. So how did David do that? What was David's secret? How could he be this kind, this forgiving, this gracious? Because David had a secret. David had what Covey would call an abundance mentality. He believed that there was enough pie to go around. And not only, but David believed that God was the source for him, and that God helped them win, and the Lord gave them victory, and where God provided for them, he would provide for them in the future. And so he was able to be gracious and able to be kind and able to give because he knew that he was backed up by God. Well, that makes all the difference in the world. So what about you? When we're thinking about our relationships, how do we improve our relationships? How do we do good? How do we sow seeds? Here's the first thing we have to buy into. We have to buy into the idea that it's God's plan of sowing and reaping. That it's God's plan. It may be counterintuitive. It may think, no, I can't sow anything. I need people to give to me. Listen, we've learned something. We've watched it around here. Sometimes people say, I don't have the time. Listen, if you don't have time, you want to sow time. I don't have any friends. If you don't have friends, you need to sow friendship to somebody else. There's things you can sow. It is counterintuitive, but it's God's plan and it works. The one who made us knows how we live, knows how we operate. And so he just said, look, if you'll sow, and listen, it's a long-term strategy, but it works. So let's talk about sowing good seeds. And sowing good seeds is the golden rule of relationships. I've thought about that. I haven't heard about the golden rule in a long time. Golden rule, here it is, right here. Do to others whatever you would like them to do to you. This is the essence of all that's taught in the law and the prophets. This is Jesus talking. He said, do to others whatever you would like them to do to you. Now listen, don't add to that, and they will. You just treat them regardless, and you trust God for the rest. I'm going to be good to you. Now, see, that's counterintuitive. Everybody gets quiet, like, ooh. There's a lady who was making breakfast one Saturday morning. She had a little boy, her little boys, one was 6, one was 4, and they were sitting there, and she was cooking pancakes. And you know how pancakes, that smell starts to go, and little boys start to argue about who's going to get the first pancake. And the mom decided this is a great time to do an object lesson. And she said, boys, if Jesus were here, if Jesus was sitting right here, Jesus would say, oh no, mommy, I don't want the first pancake. Give my brother the first pancake. It got quiet as the boys looked at one another. Finally, the 6-year-old looked over the 4-year-old and he said, Ryan, you be Jesus. Here's the deal, guys. That's all of us want somebody else to be Jesus in our life. But we can choose that. Let me give you 3 good seeds that you can sow. David sowed them, we can sow them. The first one would be the seed of forgiveness. Forgiveness, especially to those who disappoint us. I'm sure David was disappointed with those 200 fighting men. He was disappointed, but he forgave them. He had to forgive them and go on, or he could have never treated them well. Listen, people will disappoint you. I had to deal with that this week. My daughter, I only have one girl, 2 boys, 1 girl. My daughter, Christina, sat across from me this week. She was visiting with her son, Grant. And she looked at me, she said, Dad, she said, I've got to tell you something. She said, now that we're living just north of Dallas, she said, I'm going to pull for the Dallas Cowboys. And it gets worse. And she said, I'm going to raise Grant to pull for the Dallas Cowboys. My only grandson. I actually looked at her and I looked at her and said, I did not raise you this way. And she told me this during the 4th quarter meltdown from the Texans. Now we're laughing about it. I know I set you up on that one real bad. Y'all were waiting for the big bomb to drop. And it kind of was. But anyway, the deal is, how many times have parents sat across from their children and had their children say, I don't want your faith and I don't want your values, or I don't want how I've been raised. And it is so disappointing, and it can drive a wedge in the relationship unless we determine that, hey, I'm going to forgive. Forgiveness doesn't mean we agree with it. It doesn't mean it's right. It means I'm not going to hit back at you. I'm going to just forgive you. So we forgive those who disappoint us, those who've been unkind to us, and then we give God room to move in their lives. Forgiveness, I would probably have to tell you, is the bedrock of our relationship, our family relationship. I've learned over the years to say I'm sorry. Joy has extended forgiveness. We've extended forgiveness to one another. And I've said I'm sorry to my children. And I have noticed that as a family, still today, we are a family that apologizes and a family that forgives. It's key for relationships. Forgiveness. Second one is kindness. That we can sow seeds of kindness to those who are weak. Because all of us have weak spots. Everybody's got weak spots. My wife, who is tough as nails, I mean, she can deal with pain. She's a hard worker, but my wife has got a serious weak spot. She cannot handle blood or vomit. Won't do it. So when the kids would throw up, I'm thinking, honey, kids just throw up. She's like, I'm out. Excuse me, you're out? Yeah, she's like, yeah, I can't do it. And listen, parents, I know that not as many people have carpet today, but you're not a parent until your child throws up on the carpet on the way to the bathroom. You're like, why didn't you go to the bathroom? I was trying. No, you didn't try hard enough. And there it is. And Joy's like, I'm out. So for 37 years, anybody throws up in our family, I clean it up. I have no other skills, but I can clean up throw up. And she didn't handle blood. Matt cut himself one time, sliced himself under the chin. I looked at him and went, okay, we got to take him to the emergency room. I told Joy, don't freak out. Joy sees him. She's like, I said, don't do that. We go to the emergency room. They put the little guy down. He's 5 years old. They put him down on the chair. He pulls out a needle about that long and starts to stick it right there in the thing. And I'm looking around for Joy. She's gone. She didn't just go sit down. She left the room. Nurse looked at me. She said, do we need a chair for Dad? I'm like, no, I'll be okay. I'm all right. It's a weak spot, and we laugh about that. But everybody has weak spots. Everybody has areas that they're weak. So we're kind to people's weak spots. And you listen, punishing weakness won't cure it. Kindness will. Forgiveness, seeds of kindness, seeds of generosity. That we're generous to people sometimes who can't pay us back. That we're generous to people who may not be able to return it. We're generous to the people who come across our path. A man told about the fact that he used to, when he became a new believer, he wore these little cross pins on his shirt or his lapel. He said they were cheap. He bought them by the dozen. Whenever anyone would say, hey, that's a nice little pin, he would take it off and give it to them. He walked into 7-Eleven one day. A lady behind the counter looked at him and said, well, that's a beautiful, beautiful pin. He took it off and gave it to her. She didn't want to take it. It really took him a while for him to convince her to take the cross pin. He left and didn't think anything more about it. Years later, he's now a pastor. He's walking across the lobby of the church, and a lady stopped him. She was trembling. She said, sir, I just want to thank you. She said, you don't remember me. She said, but years ago, you gave me this. And she held out her hand, and it was that cross pin. She said, you gave me this. She said, when you gave me this pin, she said, my life could not have been any worse than it was at that time. She said, but when you gave me this generous gift, it made me realize that maybe God still loved me. She said, thank you for changing my life. Little seeds can have a big impact. Being generous. And how can we do it? How can we be generous? How can we be forgiving? How can we be kind? I think there's a secret here, guys. It's what Covey calls the abundance mentality. An abundance mentality means there's enough pie for everyone. There's enough kindness and goodness, and I have enough strength and resources because I believe that God will be generous to me. And I believe that if God's on my side, that I can give and he can make up the difference in my life. I can forgive and he can help me. I can be kind and he'll comfort me. If God's for me, who can be against me? And having God on our side gives us the strength to go ahead. And we remember that if anyone has been forgiving and kind and generous to us, it's been God. Look what it says here. For when we were still without strength, in due time, Christ died for the ungodly. When we were weak, when we were wrong, he died for us. One quick story, then I'll close. In Glasgow, Scotland, a number of years ago, a young girl who had been very rebellious toward her parents finally rejected her parents, their values, their faith, and she left for an unrestricted life. Her life of freedom turned into a life of misery as she ran out of money, had to sell her body for pennies, and lived and survived only because there were rescue missions in Glasgow that would feed her. She cut herself off from her family. She didn't even realize that her father had died in her absence and that her mother was still looking for her. One day she walked into a homeless shelter, and as she walked in, she noticed a picture of her mother, and scrawled across the front in her mother's handwriting were these words, I love you still, come home. She looked at that picture, she really couldn't believe that her mother still cared. So with a trembling heart and fear, she began to work her way home. She had to walk, and when she got there at night, her heart was racing as she went to the door and she knocked on the door. But when she knocked on the door, her expression changed because the door opened. And immediately she thought, oh my gosh, someone has come into this house and they've hurt my parents. They've hurt my mom. She ran to her mom's bedroom and grabbed her mom, and her mom woke up and held her. And she looked at her mother. She said, Mom, I was so afraid because when I knocked on the door just opened, and I was so afraid that someone had come in and hurt you. And the mom smiled. She said, no, dear. She said, from the day you left, that door has never been locked. There's people who feel like that God's angry at them, that God's rejected them, that God doesn't care anymore. But if David was so forgiving and generous and kind, God is so much more forgiving and generous and kind, and his door has been left open for you.